Thanks everyone for coming. We've got 4 panelists today. This is the called Ouchea, Towards Other Worlds. And Jacolien?
I wonder if we were paired in the same panel because of the authors. Because this happens quite a lot in science fiction, speculative fiction, because Nalo, Hopkinson and Okorafor's work is actually quite different. So I was just wondering about that. But anyway, because this is the one that I'm presenting on is the one book of hers that doesn't kind of clearly fall into the science fiction genre. So it is more speculative fiction. Anyway, okay. I'm just reading it, otherwise I'm going to forget what I want to say. In the Salt Rhodes, Nalo Hopkinson uses Ezili, a voodoo spirit guide or Loa, to bear witness to the experiences of women of color in different times. This paper focuses on Mer, one of those women whose story takes place shortly before the slave rebellion on San Domingue, also known as the Pearl of the Antilles. It was France's most profitable colony until the successful slave revolt, after which it was renamed Haiti. I'll discuss the relationship between Mer and her Loa Ezili and their conflict with the priest Makandal and his Loa Ogu, but also Mer's strategy of resistance, which is predicated on both survival and helping others endure. The successful revolution in San Domingue was and remains an important symbol in the Caribbean, and by choosing to depict not the rebellion itself, but the period leading up to it, Hopkinson makes her reader aware of some of the conditions that made it possible, particularly the role that women played, which has been mostly neglected in favor of a focus on violent male-driven resistance. Although the San Domingue thread of the novel is largely centered on Mer, her lover Tipinji, and her antagonist-turned-friend Georgine, the interactions between Mer Ezili and Makandal Ogu are crucial to the plot and to Hopkinson's commentary on women's place in movements of resistance. Ezili is depicted as an imperfect spiritual being who does what she can through almost imperceptible nudges to influence people to help those who pray to her. For example, in a climactic scene, she rides the plantation master's fiancé so that she can convince him to be merciful in his punishment of a runaway slave. Her subtlety is countered by the brute force of Ogo, the war maker. Near the end of the narrative, he is acknowledged as Ezili's consort, which suggests that they can complement one another. However, the version of him which Makandal serves is portrayed as a violent, unforgiving, and one-dimensional being. When Mer watches Makandal being ridden by Ogu, she describes him as a thing born in fire, tempered. Makandal wanted to clear the path to freedom too, just like I wanted to do. Richard D. E. Burton explains that Ogu does not only embody the martial spirit of Haitian resistance, he is also a healer, and if he inflicts suffering with his sword, he also suffers on his own account. Because he is capable of turning his violence against the people in whose name he acts, but also, in a final suicidal gesture against himself, he symbolizes all of the ambiguities of power in action. In the novel, Ogo and Makandal's poison plot puts everyone's safety at risk, and it is precisely because of the danger posed to all of the slaves that Mer and Ezili are critical of the strategy. Mer's stance on Makandal creates a temporary rift between her and Tipinji, who feels that the end justifies the means. Even when her daughter nearly dies from accidentally drinking some of the poisoned water, she tells Mer, "Makandal is our weapon. Sometimes the machete slips in your hand and cuts you. It's not the machete at fault then, it's your carelessness." Mer's sense of duty to Ezili and her people means that she feels compelled to do whatever she can to ease the hardships of their lives in slavery, provide medicinal and spiritual support to help them survive and endure, and to also prevent loss of lives due to overt violent resistance. She cannot agree with Makandal's campaign of death, which aims to poison all of the white people on the island because of its cost to the slaves themselves. Except for Tipinji's daughter nearly dying, another slave, Milo, is flayed alive after someone tells the plantation owner that he had been boasting about how the slaves will soon be free. And Makandal poisons another slave, Hopping John, to prevent him from revealing their plot to the plantation owners. Mer tells Makandal that each day I live is another day I can help my people, to which he replies, help them do what they're told, ease their dying from overwork or starvation, help them learn to be good slaves. To him, Mer's duty is betrayal and collusion with the white people. In the end, they are unable to agree on how the power of the slave owners should be challenged, and their disagreement is mirrored in the laws they serve. Ezili describes Ogo as a power fighting her, distracting her, while she tries to fight slavery. The antagonism culminates in the scene where Ogo, through Makandal, takes away Mer's capacity for speech, literally silencing her, in an act which stands for the violence with which particular brands of anti-colonial practices aim to right wrongs, the kind that exclude women. In the lead-up to this violent act, Ezili wakes a sleeping Mer and guides her to a covert gathering of Guinan. Unbeknownst to her, the gathering is not just a celebration, as she had thought, but also a ceremony led by Makandal to call on Ogo to help them break their enslavement. His call is successful, and through him as conduit, the Loa asks the slaves to pledge that they will fight for their freedom. Watching the summoning, Ezili examines, and this is a longish quote, the streaming possibilities, the forked and branching channels of Makandal's flow, a strong man with vision, a fierce and necessary man. He can burn Sandomingo clean and free like brush fire clears the bush for planting. But what is he doing here tonight? It was folly to come. He can root the slave keepers if only he keeps himself safe. Ezili acknowledges the potential role of violence in their fight for freedom, but she also thinks that Makandal is being reckless. When she tries to ride him to influence his actions, Ogo blocks her. The future possibilities that spring out of his actions, guided solely by Ogo, are all about iron, steel, and fire, souls of war forged in conflagration, quote from the novel. When Mer realizes that the great house has been set on fire by Makandal's people, she calls on Ezili for help, and her plea pulls the Loa out from Makandal, where she was trying to oust Ogo. The two humans, ridden by the Loas, bring the spiritual conflict into a physical realm. Ezili wants Mer to warn the sleeping slaves in the great house and lead the people away from the Guinan meeting. But Ogo interprets this as treachery and orders the other slaves to hold down Mer. Makandal only has one arm, so the quote makes sense. Ogo, in Makandal's body, used his good hand to draw my tongue out from my mouth. Then smiling, he used the arm that was not there and sliced the spirit machete across my tongue. Pain exploded like light in my head. I tried to scream, but with no air in my chest, it came out a gurgle. Mer's tongue is intact, but her faculty of speech is severely damaged, turning her into just a silent nègre woman. The conflict demonstrates how the violent silencing of women weakens their resistance. It takes Mer, a respected elder to whom many look for guidance, months to recover enough to speak only a few hoarse words, forcing her to find other ways to communicate. Makandal Ogo operate only within violent absolutes, which leaves no space for alternative strategies, while Mer and Ezili's cautious and fluid responses, which require subtlety and an ability to adjust course depending on events, is rejected in favor of the fire and outright violence of Ogo Makandal's approach. Makandal's eventual execution by fire reflects the way in which the violence unleashed in service of its resistance in the end does not distinguish between its victims. In her reading of the novel, Milena Marankova proposes that the confrontation between them dramatizes the bifurcated nature of anti-colonial resistance. Mer Ezili's desire to save and Mer's subsequent mutilation by the warrior god is a reminder of the unpalatable aspects of the capital H history-making on which Makandal Ogo has embarked, rigidly identitarian and narrowly dogmatic. Complementary to Marankova's point about the tensions within anti-colonial resistance is Arlene Kaiser's idea that certain types of contemporary fictions function as fictionalized theories, which never question the need to struggle against a system that has consistently subjugated people of African descent, but the means through which such resistance can be carried out are closely examined and the contradictions inherent in certain modes of resistance are evaluated. Hopkinson never questions the necessity of resistance, but at the same time she does not shy away from drawing her readers' attention to the contradictions. Thus, she does not romanticize anything, but demonstrates how fraught with difficulty resistance is and has been, and that resistance strategies are not straightforward solutions, but that they come with their own problems. The conflict between Ezili and Ogo is unresolved in Mer's time, but near the end of the novel, Ezili reunites with all of the voodoo Ras, including the warrior Ogo. She comes to the realization that she is not alone in her fight. I can be water and anger and beauty and love, but there is also iron and fire, warfare and thunder and storm. Voodoo is a philosophy, a way of life that is representative of the cumulative experiences of those who practice it. Its spirit guides, particularly Hopkinson's portrayal of Ezili, also exemplify the creative, creolized responses necessitated by lives lived in slavery. When the existing pattern of cultural and social life was broken by the Middle Passage, the enslaved had to weave a new pattern out of the broken one. Instead of fracturing under the crushing pressure of enslavement, they created fractals that form the pattern of a spiritual strategy of survival that relies on the ability to be flexible and responsive. In addition to highlighting creativity, Hopkinson also emphasizes the importance of the interconnectedness of people. In the novel, Ezili describes it as joined tributaries of lives, watery webs that connect each one's story to each. And in an interview, Hopkinson has said that it is people's relationships to one another which both save and doom them. The non-linear, fluid structure of the narrative draws together the lives of different women of color, and their experiences prompt the reader to consider the question of what it means to be political and how one can be political in a climate of disillusionment. Marinkova's Deleuzian reading of the novel concludes that micropolitical acts are the answer. These are creative and affect-driven interventions into power relations that resist containment within conventional macropolitical structures. For example, she suggests that Mer refuses to join Makanel's cause because it risks perpetuating the inhumanity of the hegemonic macropolitical structure. Ezili's way is not the forcefulness of Ogo. Instead, she moves people through simple acts, small ones that might seem almost invisible if viewed one at a time, but together have an incremental effect. Mer serves the spirits by helping her people through the accumulation of a series of such small but significant deeds. In a key passage, Tippenjee describes Mer as the hands of Papa God himself. People talk but do nothing, the Guinan people said. Papa God doesn't talk, but he does plenty. Mer, her words remained in her head, but her actions went out into the world. There was healing in her hands, release. Mer takes her responsibility as healer and caretaker so seriously that when Tippenjee's husband Patrice offers to take both of them to stay with the Maroons, she refuses. She does so because of the obligation that she feels she has to her people. She cannot choose her own personal freedom over well-being of those who would still be living in slavery. But she also stays because Ezili's instruction that she must fix the drying sea in the minds of the Guinan. The sea roads, the salt roads, I can't follow them to their source anymore. I land up in the same foul, stagnant swamp every time. You must fix it, Mer. After Mer and Tippenjee decide to stay on the plantation, their story jumps forward by several years. Tippenjee's daughter is married to a free colored man who bought both of them, and for the first time in their lives they had some ease. Mer, in her old age, still practices her healing craft on their surrounding plantations, yet she thinks she failed Ezili. Despite her declaration of failure, she goes on to say that she had taught Tibois, the young slave boy she helped raise, all she knew about the Loa she calls Mami Wata or La Sirene. She taught him what her favorite foods are and colors, how to sing the songs that honor her. Tibois is a man now, they tell me. Perhaps he will find a way to clear the spirit road for Mami Wata. By teaching him, she makes sure that their newly formed creolized culture is passed on to the next generation, providing a continued source of spiritual strength. The Loa makes it clear that she acts in the world through such as Mer. Her every act of love, of healing, strikes a blow to the evil we fight. In Deleuzian terms, her micropolitical acts taking place on such an intimate personal level challenge the oppressive regimes of slavery and patriarchy. While she might not have acted in an overtly revolutionary manner, Mer does make a difference by teaching Tibois about the Loas through the voodoo flags she creates in her old age and her healing craft she practices throughout her life. Therefore, her acts, small as they may be perceived by some, are just as important, or maybe even more important, as other more overt and sometimes violent acts of resistance. In the novel, there is no satisfaction of an ultimate confrontation with or resolution of the far-reaching consequences of slavery. Ezili's fight has no clear end in sight because slavery's echoes in this fictional setting, but also in the real world, become mutated in the later temporal spaces of the story, and they continue to be embedded in the oppressive systems of authority and governance, necessitating the continuance of creative, realized responses from descendants of the enslaved. Viewing the novel through a Deleuzian lens like Marinkova does, one can recognize that the acts of the woman in the novel couple creativity and politics, and is ultimately driven by ethology, the ability of a body to affect others and be affected by others. The value of micropolitical acts, often the only ones available to silenced enslaved women, in challenging the corrosive effects of slavery on the self, is personified by Ezili. These acts, which are grounded in survival and helping others survive, is a strategy of resistance which emphasizes adaptation rather than assimilation. The novel demonstrates that the stories of women like Mel are not only worthy of being passed on, but that it is crucial that they are voiced to engage productively with the future through the past.
I think we'll do all 4 presentations and then open up the floor.
In the Nigerian science fiction writer Nedine Okorafor's text titled Who Fears Death, we are introduced to a girl named Onyesonwu who, as a child of rape, is shamed and ostracized. To restore some honor to her family, she undergoes the 11th rite, a coming-of-age ritual where juju magic is used to cause a young girl to feel unbearable pain in order she is too aroused until she's married. Consequently, women's sexuality is suppressed and put under the control of men. Although the 11th rite contains fantasy elements and the use of magic, it sheds light on similar ways which attempts are made to combat women's sexual autonomy in the real world. The sexual suppression can take the form of bodily modifications and can also occur culturally when women's sexual subordination is made to seem natural. Consequently, questions are raised concerning why this occurs and who benefits. Using Okorafor's novel and research by Roy Baumeister et al. And Andrea Dworkin, I shall attempt to explore some of these questions. It should be noted that due to the nature of the text being analyzed in the pool of research available, my presentation will focus on power balances and sexual relationships between males and females. However, I do believe that similar analyses could be done on other sexualities and gender relationships. The naturalized assumption of women's sexual subordination pervades almost all facets of society, influencing interpersonal interactions and relationships between humans, as well as shaping gender roles and expectations. While there is much debate on whether constructionist or essentialist theories best describe human sexuality, as well as ongoing disagreements about the part natural selection plays, it is hard to deny that several cultures have made determined efforts to suppress women's sexuality in particular. For example, Derek Krieger points out that in America, boys and men are thought to receive praise and positive attributions from others for non-marital sexual contacts, while girls and women are believed to be derogated and stigmatized for similar behaviors. As evidence, Krieger used surveys done on students between grades 7 to 12 and found that sexually permissive girls had fewer friendship nominations than girls who report no sexual partners, whereas in contrast, sexually inexperienced boys have significantly less peer nominations than boys with one or more sexual partners. From this, it becomes clear that for males, heterosexual success has a directly proportional relationship with social acceptance, whereas with women, the opposite is true. The phenomena is typically referred to as the sexual double standard. After much investigation, Roy Baumeister and Jean Twenge have offered 2 possible explanations. They have termed the male control theory and the female control theory. The former, according to Baumeister et al., posits that men have conspired to set up a system that oppresses women so as to stifle female sexuality, and that men benefit from that stifling. They put forth many reasons why such a system might be set up, one of them being objectification, which is a process whereby women are reduced to mere instruments, bodies that exist for the pleasure of others. Thus, female sexual suppression may be a means of preventing women from acting like active agents with their own desires. As Baumeister et al. Suggest, it could be that men do not want women to be autonomous creatures who make their own decisions and seek their own fulfillment, because such activities could potentially undermine male control. This idea shares similar lines of reasoning with the hypothesis that the male control of women's autonomy is motivated by the unsubstantiated fear that female sexuality represents a potential threat to orderly society. Expanding on this concept, Baumeister et al. Turn to several feminist texts which propose that the prevalent belief that female promiscuity would cause social chaos has led to the sexual suppression of women in false hopes of maintaining peace and order. Gerda Lerner, one of the feminist writers Baumeister et al. Reference, thus concludes that the sexual regulation of women is an essential feature of patriarchal power. Another reason proposed is insecurity. According to this hypothesis, males may be threatened by the lack of physical limitations present in female sexuality, such as the absence of a refractory period or visible arousal, and thus, out of malice and envy, attempts to suppress it. A variation of this hypothesis states that men are instead insecure about the sexual prowess of other men, and thus do not want female partners to have a basis for comparison. In short, the male control theory states that men have systemically suppressed women's sexuality. The main reasons proposed for this encompass fear and envy of female sexuality, insecurity, and the fear that female sexuality could threaten social order. The female control theory, as described by Baumeister et al., suggests that instead of men, it is women who are responsible for systemically suppressing their own sexuality. Baumeister et al. Admits that this theory appears to be implausible simply because men have held superior political and social power throughout most of history. Nevertheless, they employ an economic viewpoint of human sexual relations to hypothesize that the female control theory may be motivated by social exchange. In other words, if female sexuality is kept scarce, its value increases and thus becomes a more powerful bargaining asset for less abusive treatment from males, among other things. Both the male control theory and the female control theory have proponents. Supporters of the female control theory, which include Baumeister et al., claim that mothers and female peers are the main source that teach adolescent girls to refrain from sexual activity. They also claim that men do not appear to be important or effective sources of proximal influence toward the general restraint of female sexuality. Skeptics, however, have pointed out that the female control theory might be flawed. Firstly, sexual bargaining tends to take place in situations where economic and social resources are not available. Thus, the female control theory, if true, becomes proof of patriarchal oppression, which limits women's access to other sources of power, such as wealth and social currency. Baumeister et al. Briefly touch on this point when they admit that under the female control theory, men benefit sexually if women are desperate for money and other resources, but ultimately end up agreeing with the female control theory with the claim that attributing women's sexual suppression to men would be to remove women's historical agency. Supporters of the male control theory, such as Laurie Rudman et al., point out that Baumeister and Twenge emphasize evidence that women discourage their female friends from having casual sex, but considering that women likely receive suppressing messages from all genders in an attempt to protect them from social stigma. Thus, Rudman et al. Conclude that Baumeister and Twenge were correct to consider social stigma, but were wrong to imagine that only women counsel women against having casual sex to protect their reputation. Furthermore, in their own studies, Rudman et al. Found little support for the sexual economics proposed by Baumeister et al. To explain the female control theory. Instead, they suggest that men's tendency to view women as sexual prey is a far bigger influence of sexual suppression than gossip from same-sex peers. Furthermore, in a different article, Rudman and Janal Fetterolf argue that portraying women as using sex to barter for male resources dehumanizes women because it signifies that their bodies are the most precious resource women have to exchange in a close relationship. Lastly, Rudman et al.'s accusations that Baumeister et al. Draw from outdated and incomplete studies lead me to side with their conclusion that it is in fact the male control theory which is mostly responsible for the cultural suppression of women's sexuality. This is in alignment with research by scholars such as Candace Blake et al., who investigate Tunisian culture and report that both men and women can suppress female sexuality, although the function in either case appears to be more closely aligned with male rather than female interests. The mechanisms which allow for the removal of sexual autonomy are elucidated by Andrea Dawkins in her iconic text, Intercourse. In her lifetime, Dawkins remained a controversial feminist figure due to her views which were sometimes regarded as sex negative. However, regardless of whether you agree with her overall conclusions, many of her critiques concerning the problematic aspects of society prove to be quite valuable. Her text is notable for its coarse and direct language, as well as the liberal use of literature to illustrate certain points. Thus, just as Dawkins turns to fiction novels to demystify reality, so too will I frequently reference Okorafor's Who Fears Death. My analysis will focus on two mechanisms of social control Dawkins writes on, which may lead to sexual suppression. The first involves misogynistic conceptualizations of intercourse, and the second involves physical coercion. Popular conceptions of intercourse often normalize forms of hostile sexism, which subordinate women and remove their agency. Typically, women are viewed as sexual prey that is to be conquered by the dominant male who, in doing so, achieves possession of the woman. Dworkin expresses this slightly more crudely when she writes that intercourse is commonly conceptualized as a form of possession or an act of possession in which, during which, because of which, a man inhabits a woman, physically covering her and overwhelming her and at the same time penetrating her, and this physical relation to her, over her, and inside her is his possession of her. He has her, or when he is done, he has had her. By thrusting into her, he takes her over. His thrusting into her is taken to be her capitulation to him as a conqueror. It is a physical surrender of herself to him. He occupies and rules her, expresses his elemental dominance over her by his possession of her in the act. Dworkin adds that the act is often taken to be an act of invasion and an act of ownership, undertaken in a mode of predation. To illustrate this, Dworkin references Satan and Gorée by Isaac Bashevis Singer. However, as previously stated, I shall be using Okorafor's Spookiest Death. The novel is set in Darfur. As previously mentioned, it features the protagonist named Anya Sonbu, who faces prejudice because she is a child of rape, and thus chooses to undergo the 11th rite to restore honor to her family. As we are exposed to a society of juju magic and camels used as transport, we find that many of the observations Dworkin makes about our world holds true in Anya Sonbu's. Not unexpectedly, gender roles position women as subordinate possessions of men and make intercourse yet another site of male dominance. Ideas of intercourse as a relationship between a subject, typically male, who acts, and an object, typically female, who is acted upon, is far from harmless, and this is quite brilliantly illustrated in the conflict between the two tribes in Kufi's death, named the Okeke and the Nuru. Motivated by a shared holy book, the Nuru tribe enslaves and subjugates the Okeke tribe. As part of their domination of the Okeke, the men proceed to go on a rampage of rape. This is a warfare tactic known as weaponized rape, which objectifies women by essentially turning them into what are spoils of war but are looted alongside other commodities. Furthermore, as women are considered property of their husbands and fathers, it also serves to humiliate the Okeke men and dishonor them. This is made possible through conceptions of intercourse which pit women as sexual prey to be conquered, as one could not imagine weaponized rape occurring in situations where intercourse was viewed as a union of equals, or if intercourse was seen as an act of submission for men. Unfortunately, the concept of weaponized rape is not one which is strictly relegated to fantasy novels. Okorafor was inspired to write the novel after reading a 2003 article about the Darfur conflict. The author of the article, Emily Wax, includes interviews of women who were subjected to weaponized rape at the hands of militiamen. The raping, according to Wax, was done to humiliate the women, their husbands and fathers, and to weaken tribal ethnic groups. This leaves one to wonder whether sexual assault would be as prolific in a world where intercourse was not associated with male power, ownership, and dominance. The second mechanism discussed by Dworkin is physical coercion. This often takes the form of genital mutilation or cutting, which involves modification of the female genitalia and is often part of a larger coming-of-age ritual into womanhood. The naming of the procedure is riddled with controversy. Scholars such as Obioma Nameka claim that the word mutilation conjures imagery of knives and blades, which may not be necessarily accurate, as in some communities hot water is used instead. Furthermore, the term mutilation may result in negative perceptions of certain groups of people and their cultures. Okorafor, on the other hand, argues that the word mutilation is fitting. On her blog, she justifies this by claiming that the word female circumcision falsely implies that it is the equivalent of male circumcision. For the sake of this presentation, I shall use the acronym FGMC, which stands for Female Genital Mutilation or Cutting or Circumcision. Some, like Richard Schroeder, claim that the practice is celebrated in certain cultures, and that opposition to FGMC may be influenced by different in cultural values. Furthermore, he adds that while outsiders might view the practice as a form of sexual suppression, the adherents, such as the Ouchea in Kenya, speak of it in terms of cleanliness, beauty, and adulthood. Opponents of FGMC nevertheless insist that it is an attempt to suppress female sexuality. Journalist Quanta Ahmed, for example, claims the practice is the absolute denial of a girl or woman a future as a sexual entity, and Dworkin takes a similar stance. According to Dworkin, FGMC has been used on women around the world to take away sexual drive and behavioral nonconformity. At its worst, FGMC takes the form of infibulation, which Dworkin regards as a violation on a civilly inferior group. Infibulation is a procedure whereby the birth canal is stitched closed enough to prevent intercourse, and thus, as Dworkin explains, infibulated women are partially cut open at marriage and must be fully cut open at childbirth, after which they are sewn up again. For these reasons, Dworkin regards FGMC as another form of sexual suppression which aims to limit women's autonomy, in some cases through irreversible body modification. Okorafor also poses similar critiques of FGMC, although she, as an African writer and Igbo Nigerian, also takes into account the practice's cultural significance. In her blog, she states that what it all boils down to, and I believe the creators of this practice knew this even 1,000 years ago, is the removal of a woman's ability to properly enjoy the act of sex. Again, this is about the control and suppression of women. This perspective leads into her novel through the aforementioned 11th rite ritual. Here, Onyesanwu and her friends undergo an FGMC procedure performed by the older women of her community. Because of the juju magic used, the girls feel torturous pain during arousal, a condition that is only cured by marriage. This represents the ultimate control of a woman's sexuality by men, leading Onyesanwu to look at her boyfriend Rita and complain that women are raised to deny their own sexuality, and thus aren't as free as men. In modern times, various women-led social liberation and feminist movements have improved gender equality, reduced rates of FGMC around the world, and caused cultural shifts that remedy some of the harmful byproducts of the sexual double standard. Nevertheless, a strong resistance to women's sexual autonomy still exists today. In South Africa, cultural practices which prioritize women's virginity above men's still pervade, and corrective rape reveals that women's sexuality is suppressed along multiple axes. However, Okorafor does offer some words which inspire hope for change. When in her blog she writes that culture is alive and it is fluid, it is not made of stone, nor is it absolute. Some traditions, practices will be discarded and some will be added, but the culture still remains what it is.
Sorry. Okay, I'll just start. So this is part of my master's thesis in art history. And the thesis is motivated by a visual art performance experience that I had at the Michaelis Gallery at the University of Cape Town. Today, 28th August 2014, I am at the Michaelis Gallery's space at the University of Cape Town. The main subject of my visit is South African visual artist Buhlebezwe Siwani's performance. People have been talking about how they find her work thought-provoking and the unknowing feeling I have creates excitement for the evening. Unfamiliar with Siwani, the artist, and her work, I am anticipating the performance as an experience that will be a topic in the conversation for the rest of the night, if not the rest of the week. Siwani's performance is titled in isiXhosa, Inzilo ngoba ngihlala kwabafileyo, loosely translated as the mourning I leave with the dead. Mourning is grieving for those who have died or passed on. Inzilo is not an easy process because the issue of loss is both a private and public moment that is experienced, handled, and treated differently in diverse places and cultures in Africa. Siwani's performance is part of a group exhibition entitled Between Subject and Object, Human Remains at the Interface of Art and Science. The curatorial statement reveals that the exhibition explores human remains, their actual human limbs in the space, and death as a universal topic. The main concern is around issues of real, whether expressed through object, performance, photography, film, science, or other modes of representation. Siwani's performance is in a small room, a part of the gallery space where videos are usually projected. As the primary incitement, I follow the smell of incense into the dim space with reddish lighting. I make sure I'm amongst the first to enter the space, as my aim is to have a full view of what will happen in the room. Inside the performance space, there is a triangular
Inside the performance space, there's a triangular-shaped pile of soil in the middle of the floor. There's a bench on the right side from where I'm standing, in front of the soil and close to the wall. On it is an old television box. There's a physical matching boxing match playing. Not far from the bench, on the floor, is a candle, and on it is a lion matchbox. Right? Siwani kneels on the other side of the bench, facing the wall, with her back to the audience. She's wearing a black bra and panty as she silently faces the wall, as if waiting for everyone to enter and fill the room. On the opposite far end of the space, there's a pile of mattresses, about 5 or 6 of them, which are stacked on each other. On the top mattress, I see a black textured cloth, leopard print fabric, and a broom. I have observed all these objects and the subject when Siwani begins the performance with an incantation that sounds like a prayer. Mthandazo fana nobawo wethu osemazulwini, that is our Father in heaven. Words in isiXhosa and isiZulu. The incantation, which might not even be a prayer, I describe in this way because my understanding of prayer is influenced by my Christianity. Mthandazo is a way of worshiping God and a connection with the Holy Spirit, whereas from the smell of Impepo, I'm drawing connections to my cultural background as a South African person. This beginning of the performance looks like a creation of spiritual connection or ties. I do not know Siwani, and thus my spirit is not trying to connect. My communication with God and fellowship are part of an agreement with the Holy Spirit and the people I am praying with. My interpretation might not be the same as another person because what works for me I cannot impose on another individual understanding. I describe the action of Mthandazo as an intimate time with God, fellowship, spiritual connection, and a search for strength or comfort. In a sense, prayer is my communication with God. Prayer without understanding is, in a way, subject to distance or confusion in one's meaning and intention. This is a description I purposely make during Siwani's performance. Sekutheni ethandaza okanye sithandaza, khona sithandaza, ubani sithandazela bani. Basically, why is she praying, or are we praying, and to who or what are we praying for? I simply cannot come to terms with Siwani, why Siwani did not brief the audience or ask concerning the issue of prayer. Probably Siwani uses incantation as a way of gaining courage going forward with her performance. If this is the case, the physical activity in the performance seems temporarily contained by the spirit behind the movement. If this is the case, the physical activities in the performance seem temporarily contained, but the spirit behind the movement is the one that lives on forever. That alone, if not else, should be an excuse for me to not be in this room. I'm looking around the performance space and the audience, and with the corner of my eye, I'm trying to find the door so that I can make an exit. Regretfully, the room is packed, and if I am to make a move, I might disturb not only the crowd, but possibly the artist too. Perhaps a little silent prayer will help my discomfort. Let me say my own prayer and ask God for protection. My spirit is not connecting to this other prayer. I'm only asking for protection in case I encounter what I'm not meant to see. I try to recuperate my feelings. Prayer should provide a sense of calm, strength, and comfort. But is this not a way of distancing myself from cultural practices, since there is the smell of Impepo upon entering the gallery and the performance space? I think to myself, Impepo is used as traditional incense for different occasions in my Xhosa culture. Impepo in my home has been burnt to get rid of unwanted spirits in ceremonies and rituals of death, and rites of passages, when an animal, either a goat or a cow, is slaughtered. However, growing up, there's always been a strong warning when any of these ceremony practices was in operation, not to dare ask or go in the direction where the slaughtering took place. It is as though everything was done in secrecy. As a child, I was very curious and keen to know about what took place. Thus, the little information I received as a grown-up was from my uncle, who told me that the main concern was to teach children respect. The fact that there was so much secrecy about matters of ceremonies added to the fact that I have since considered certain practices sacred, a situation that left much room for speculation, gossip, suspicion, and assumptions that were not checked or corrected. All the same, as I continue to watch Siwani, as I continue to watch the performance, okay, that's fine. Siwani holds a lit candle in her hand while continuing with the incantation. After some interaction time spent on the bench and in front of the soil, Siwani approaches the mattress. She is putting on the black cloth, which is a transparent dress decorated with buttons. She climbs onto the mattresses and starts to fold the leopard print fabric into a triangular shape, then walks with it in hand to the floor where the pile of soil is. Siwani then continually folds and buries the fabric many times in the soil. During this time, the incantation has turned into conversation that is only known to the performer. Continuously, Siwani talks while burying the fabric, lying on her back on the soil with the fabric under her head like a pillow. At the end of the performance, her body and the fabric are covered under the pile of soil. The performance is an open secret that there is a burial taking place. The combination of the lighting of a candle, familiar scent of impeko, soil, cloth, buttons, incantation, I read as part ceremony and communication that connects with ancestors, spirits, or God. In fact, I'm viewing the body, which is Siwani, as an instrumental medium for ancestral and spiritual connection between these other elements that I've mentioned, used in the performance for the purpose of ancestral worship and ritual. Throughout Siwani's performance, there is the use of spirituality as a form of acknowledging, respecting, and speaking to the dead by incarnation of prayer. An appeal to the spiritual can also be found in the expression "I live with the dead" in the title, where Siwani makes it known that she's not separating herself from the spiritual connection with her ancestors, a connection with those who have died in her family. Therefore, in considering the interpretation of death, can be a ritual that is carried out when a family member has died, where a funeral or burial is the action of covering the body in the soil as a way of cutting physical ties and making supplications to the dead, which is a spiritual word. Siwani seems to be paying respect to a spiritual order or a collective ancestral power. This means Siwani's performance is an open experience that is a connecting point between the physical body and spiritual positions or locations. At this point, the performance has significance for me. I regard burial as a central physical connection with those who have died. This provides another opportunity for me to look at the rest of the audience. All their faces seem curious and focused on the artist rather than uncomfortable. I am now hoping that one person who is in front like me will turn and squeeze their way between the crowd to the door, but that does not happen. Rather, I'm even thinking my feelings might be the problem. I tell myself not to be dramatic, think of it as just an art performance in a gallery, and not what it is or should not be, a real ritual. I have been feeling discomfort from the beginning of this performance. As a person with limited exposure to ceremonies, as I have mentioned, I am not sure I should be seeing this art performance. Nevertheless, I cannot shake off this now intense feeling of ritual and ceremony. So basically my paper comes from this experience that I had at the Nikelis Gallery through Buhlebezwe work. And another performance, can you please go to the next slide? Okay, next one, this is when she finished. And then after that, I think about a month later, she had this second performance at the Stevenson Gallery. which is titled Zemkingo Mamagwalandini, which focuses on the story of Nalo. So at that time, I questioned a lot of her actions in terms of my experiences in the gallery space, and therefore I could not make it to this performance, and I think I did not want to make it to the performance, right? But I did go to see the installation after the performance, and there was still the smell of Imbebo and these skulls. These are cow skulls. So I'll just get to the questions that I'm asking in my pieces. Because the question that arises, what are the ritual-like elements in Siwani's work communicating, and which lines of actual ritual are relevant to the tensions I'm having regarding ritual and performance art? And in my questions, mainly my chapters, I speak about the history of African ritual, and that's where I draw connections in terms of what has been written about African rituals. Also, what has brought influence of ritual in contemporary art. And also I asked the question whether ritual and performance art, are they even separate? You know, because you go and study art and then there's this division that is created between what is a ritual and what is art. So those are the questions I'm really asking. And then later on, after that performance, a friend of mine told me that she's a sangoma, and therefore for me it really elevated my thinking, like, okay, where do we draw the lines now between her position as a sangoma and her position as an artist, and which in her thesis she does say that she doesn't separate the two, and which in my thesis as well I'm not separating them, right? So I'm asking about the issues of position now. I think the sangoma position comes strongly in the thesis because she speaks about imfihlo. I'm just summarizing here. It's titled Imfihlo, which means secrecy. So there she's grappling with the tensions of what to reveal and what not to reveal, like what to reveal as an artist and what not to reveal as a sangoma, if there is that division. And so I'm drawing mainly from her thesis, and most importantly that these performances are happening in a gallery space, which is a very elitist, it's a white cube, and all those issues, and also the choices that she makes when she's doing a performance than when you see her on a everyday life. It's different than when she's doing the performances, which she's bringing this ritual aspect to it. And also lastly, reading her thesis, she does say that she invites her ancestors into the gallery space, so which means for me, at the end of it all, it is a ritual. You know, we are part of that ritual as it happens in the gallery space. It's not, it might be a reenactment as she says it, but at the same time, as it exists, it is. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Oh, I guess we should. Do you need my help? It's
no.
called Afems, Nedine.
It's fine.
Okay.
Good Lord.
Okay.
Say things.
Yeah, that's the one. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so as you can see from this very descriptive, non-inventive title, I just want to talk about and mainly to problematize the arrival of, or maybe the resonance of #Black Girl Magic in South African literature. So in contemporary times, we see that there is this strong call for Black women to embrace their #Black Girl Magic. Oh, I can't scroll with this thing, or can I? Okay, there we go. Okay, to embrace magic generally as a celebratory and empowering form of identity politics. Yet given this movement's very close proximity to neoliberal capitalism and popular culture, it does seem necessary then to consider what the repercussions are, I think, and also what is at stake in marking the black female as either, fantastic as in magical, and also fantastic as in an exceptional person, right, who stands above and beyond the crowd. So not to be dismissed as purely a global or American phenomenon, we see that hashtag Black Girl Magic is in fact very germane to contemporary South African fiction as well. And so, if we can scroll again, the text I'm looking at are Mohale Moshigo's The Yearning, Unathi Magubeni's, we can scroll again. This was just to show you how superficial Black Girl Magic is becoming. Compliments of capitalistic appropriation. Okay, and then Unathi Magubeni's, we can scroll again. Yes, so here we go. Unathi Magubeni's Nwezelanga, the Star Child, and then Buhlebezwe Mkhaba's The Girl Without a Sound, which is actually a children's story. Okay, so in each of these narratives, we see that the central protagonists experience magic as an internal property of their beings, and according to John Marulo III's exploration of the correlation between physics, time travel, and blackness, there are in fact ways to read hashtag Black Girl Magic as potentially affirmative in relation to this cosmic redefinition of black identity in popular culture. So in The Yearning, just to give you very short synopses of these narratives, Marubeni excels at her job and her personal relationships and enjoys a near perfect life in Cape Town. Yet she is suddenly visited by bouts of illness, dreams, and disjointed memories of her childhood. Initially fearing mental illness, her brother, who also has psychic gifts, guides her towards the water, where she begins to understand that she must in fact honor her calling. And then in Nwelezelanga, a young albino girl by the same name is abandoned and left for dead by a mother who practices the dark arts. But Nwelezelanga does not die and is found by a kind woman who adopts her and loves her as her own. Her mother soon notes her spiritual and magical talents, and it is among this new community where she then starts to serve her apprenticeship as a healer. Yet things change when a cosmic battle plays out. A dark witch actually wants to claim Nwelezelanga and then persuades her birth mother to come and sacrifice the daughter whom she failed to kill. But darkness doesn't prevail in this narrative, and we see that Nwelezelanga unleashes the strength of her magic to restore balance in this troubled world. Then The Girl Without a Sound is a children's book, as I've mentioned, where we see an imaginative little girl who lives in her head, and this is because she cannot speak. And one day a red lady from the moon starts to visit her. I think you can scroll again, because I do have some, because it's a children's narrative, so there are lovely pictures accompanying the story. A red lady from the moon starts to visit her, and they have a series of wonderful excursions together. Eventually, she learns, I think you can scroll again, yeah, she learns that she is the keeper of her magic and her voice, and that she just needs to unlock the power of her speech from within. So the font's very small, but that's more or less the gist of what the narrative states here. And so we see that consequently, this internal realization of one's magic sets the subject apart and then makes them rather special within their particular context. So in each of these narratives, we see that the fantastic or the magical is then realized as this internal property of the protagonists. Arguably, this can be described as a domestication of magic, as the grand wonder of the entire cosmos is more simply that which resides within the individual, as opposed to the external environment. And as I'm sure you can intimate, you can scroll again. As far as global trends go, we are not very far from, because this is the last page of Buhlebezwe Mkhaba's book. We are not very far from hashtag Black Girl Magic. So in quantum mechanics, John Marulo III explores the correlation between physics, time travel, and blackness. I think you can scroll again. He argues that linear time, earthly time, is anti-black, and so produces violence out of the ruptures and repetitions that blackness generates in response. So Murillo suggests that much like how a particle loses orientation in a black hole and risks approaching the point of no return, it is always better to risk non-existence by embracing this black hole, and hole as in how it's spelled there, right? So in both senses of that word. This alternative space-time dimension leads to combustive violence, but at least bears the potential for redemption as far as identity politics are concerned. So relying on contemporary physics, we see that this reconfiguration of identity connects easily to the cosmic redefinition of black identity in popular culture. Often, and as is the case here, we see that representing the expansiveness of the cosmic black hole turns into this affirmative attribute of the largesse. So this largeness that can be invested back into a black subjectivity. And so we find that this is equally true. And so I guess this is why there's an interesting conversation happening in popular culture, because popular culture, the idea or the argument is that popular culture in and of itself has always been anti-black. And then so how do we then go about configuring black subjects on their own terms when trying to engage with popular culture? And so we see that this impetus is also part of science fiction in Africa, or is becoming part of that conversation now, where we see that there is a desire to explore how magic and witchcraft are in fact these knowledge systems that predate Western science, and thus duly serves to undermine scientific authority, to illumine all the truths of the cosmos. And so often realized as a feminine form of knowledge and narratives, these magical modes of knowing come to supplement and even override rationality and technology as epistemic forms in science fiction in Africa. And they're there to critique the excesses of science and also masculinity. And so here we see that magic is being used as a positive attribute. And I think you can maybe scroll again. However, we find that there's something quite paradoxical or aporetic about the celebration of a feminine magical identity, because on the other hand, we see that there are critiques around this idea of a magical Negro. So a stereotype that already exists in popular culture. And so here, this is from Okorafor's critique on Stephen King's work, where she notes that horror is in fact full of white characters, and that the black one often only appears in the form of a magical Negro. Tracing the appearance of the magical Negro in various literary texts in early Hollywood cinema, she explains that it is the subordination of a minority figure masked as the empowerment of one. The magical Negro has great power and wisdom, yet he or she only uses it to help the white main character. He or she is not threatening because he or she serves to help, never hurt. She continues by arguing that due to a history of primitivism, the magical Negro was simply how writers of the stories viewed black people. That to them, in ways, blacks were like robots or slaves, put on earth to help white folks. So like Asimov's robots, black people had rules imprinted in their brains that made them so selfless. And so we see that here in anti-black popular culture, the black female fantastic or magical black female finds its perverse counterpart in a magical Negro or Negress. It's so then to represent black females as magical beings is in fact a cop-out then on representation, a direct signaling of some utter unknowability and subservience of the infantile black subject. So hence in Physics of Blackness, Michelle Wright then notes that it is actually mystique that lifts the body up in the white imagination. So here by foregrounding magical properties and even a sense of unknowability, we're actually doing a disservice to black characters simply because this is how they've always been represented in popular culture. And so we also find that in Playing in the Dark, Toni Morrison is equally critical of this literary trope as it appears in Mark Twain's Huck Finn. Hence, the affirmative qualities of magic are seemingly outweighed by their ability to signal at utter marginality. So while the Black fantastic allows for some ethical navigation of an anti-Black popular culture, it means that the Black subject never occupies the center of speculative fiction. There is always the assumption of the space of the alien and the strange, which means that one embraces the role of the other but never uses the discourse of speculative fiction for imaginative othering. And so in addition, we also find that critics like Hortense Spillers and even Sylvia Winter have argued that for people who haven't been recognized as human, the idea of post-human explorations in and of themselves offers very little reprieve, because it exacerbates this idea of, well, when we think about magic, also of animality and therefore a lack of humanity, generally, inhumanity. Okay, and so I think we can scroll again quickly. Okay, we can scroll again. We can move on from this. So, in a dissertation on Black girl magic, Brianna Nicole Barner explores how the word girl has been brought into play as opposed to the word woman. And she suggests that there is a redemptive project at work, as women are often addressing their younger selves who struggle through the traumatic minefield of Black girlhood. And so to celebrate themselves as women is to empower the inner child and to open up the imaginative realm of possibilities for Black girls. Yet, in an article about Here's My Problem with the hashtag Black Girl Magic, Linda Schaefer offers a candid and astute rejection of the hashtag by arguing that it only feeds into a stereotype of the strong Black woman whose body feels no pain and whose struggles must be endured with heroic fortitude. As someone who lives with chronic illness, Schaefer, feels that the label excludes Black women like her who wage a constant battle against pain and a suffering body. Hence, it feels important to question whether freedom actually lies in alleviating, the Black woman from a mandate of exceptionality. And if it's possible to imagine a world where speculative fiction can afford a fantastic Black female a slightly more complex reality than this one. I think we can scroll again. Okay, so yeah, this idea of strength above all else, right? That this is something we were celebrating again with this hashtag. So we can scroll again, I think. Because in the portrayals of the books that I'm looking at, we see that potential suffering also comes with a sense of physical exceptionalism. So the emphasis on magic, we can scroll again, since we don't have time for this. What we find is that magic can in fact be interpreted as a ruse of some sort, or maybe even a distraction from an inability to assume a mundane position in society. Moreover, apart from highlighting a strong connection between the magical Black female as that which is bred from social disenfranchisement, we find that there is an equally pervasive representation of the Black female fantastic or magical female as an anodyne to past trauma in these texts. So in Nwelezelanga, we see that she suffered the trauma of abandonment due to her albino status. In The Yearning, it also tells a tale of childhood molestation and finding healing through the spiritual dimensions of traditional healing. The spiritual dimensions of traditional healing. And in A Girl Without a Sound, we see the little girl has completely lost her ability to speak. In all of these texts, there is a common inability to cure trauma within the empirical context of the subject. The answers are always beyond the reach of reality, which then leads to the recourse to magic. And so one cannot help but wonder if this is an implicit statement rather than a political statement about the current state of hopelessness that a vast population of women actually must feel regarding the resolution of their daily South African trauma. In this instance, there is no easy answer on the one hand because, as I mentioned, the domestication of magic sets the subject apart and does make them feel special, which is important in terms of affirmation and identity. But on the other hand, we find that there is this equally pervasive representation of magic and the fantastic as merely there to, alleviate trauma. Okay? Is that a legit 1 minute? Or
Let's go.
okay,
Go
okay.
for it.
Yeah, well, that's it. So I think I've covered the main points. I can stop there.
Thanks.
Any questions or comments or conversation from the floor?
I think 1, 2, 3, and then we'll ask you to respond. Is that all right?
Thank you very much for your beautiful presentation. I just want to ask the two last speakers those questions for clarification. I don't seem to understand. Each time there are troubles, they say it's the ancestor. And then from every time there is a situation, they say the ancestors, but I've realized, I'm trying to bring it in the true life situation now, they go back to the ancestors and part of the problems are solved, sometimes it becomes more complicated. And here in your work, I say something like being black is this. If you have the power, then you should speak. So don't you think there's a bit of contradiction? I don't know. I am asking because I've heard this story of ancestor. One ancestor one uncle who calling me, who did not have any car, who told me to come and give him a car. Uncle, you are dead. You're just go. When you are alive, you didn't do anything. I hear them say the uncle says I should bring maybe a cow or whatever. When he was alive, he couldn't afford the car. How come he's dead? He wants us to buy a cow for him. Just go. For me, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. When you're alive, you couldn't do it, so just go. You're not existing. So my point is, from what you said, she could no longer speak, and yet she claimed to have the power. So where's the power? What's this black thing that? Don't you think there's a bit of contradiction? That's the first question. The second thing is, does it mean that in art industry you have to go spiritual in your gallery to get these performances? I don't know. I just want to know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If you can't afford it now, then ask for it later. So I have a question. I can't remember your name. Sorry, the guy.
Smanga.
Yes. Hello, Smanga. Smanga, I have a question with the definition of intercourse, right? You explored that a bit, but you didn't really, maybe I didn't catch it, definition of rape, because I think in any context, especially now in 2018, we're looking at those as two very different things. And whether in that book, it's something that when you engage with how because it seems like he keeps describing intercourse and rape like it's just one and the same thing, and then for me it's like, what position do you take in that? Because also it's about who defines it. Is it from a male perspective, a female perspective, and choice, when it comes to choice and how we define, again, rape and intercourse, what decisions do we make there as writers, as people who reflect on these things? So if you can just comment on that for me. Can I carry on? Okay, and then I have a question for Pili. Pili, I love that you position yourself and you say as a black Christian Xhosa woman, I find myself in this space, and I wonder if maybe the tension or the conflict in that was that not that now you're finding yourself with your two spiritualities meet in a way that they say they shouldn't meet. Is that where the tension came from? Is that what is making you feel uncomfortable? Because we know you choose. The thing is always you choose one, but now here you're colliding with two in the same space, and what's happening in yourself, and as you reflect. And black girl magic, I don't know, for me it's like, it's that thing. Do we perpetuate the stereotype, or do we just have a hashtag that lets us breathe? A hashtag that makes us be like, at least I can aspire to be that, or on a day that I feel like I'm failing at everything, I remember that I have black gold magic. I don't think for me, with the one writer that was saying, I don't know if it's just a thing to perpetuate strong black woman. I'm just like, no, it's a thing that we go to when you're not feeling like a strong black woman. I don't know. Yeah, so that's all I'm saying. Thank you.
Okay, Smanga, I just wanted to ask. Okay, I wanted to ask your rationale for putting together Dworkin and Okorafor, because Dworkin, like you said, is a very controversial figure, even in like sort of the Western canon of feminism. So just wondering about that, why you chose to look at this together. I'll be very interested in that. And then Nedine, I just wanted to ask, less on the hashtag side, more on the side of the novels you're looking at. You kind of were talking about sort of like the magic as an escape from if you can't solve a problem in empirical reality or whatever. And I was just thinking about, I suppose, Nda, and then also some other writers I know, like Anati Slasher, who would say that in the African context, magic isn't magic, it is part of the everyday, and if that offers a different view of it.
I think let's have some responses and then I'll make some more hands.
So you ask about the ancestors and the contradictions, and I think that Buhlebezwe does speak about contradictions in her work herself, in terms of, because she speaks about her body and how much she touches on a lot of things, like performance art. She speaks from that side of performance art in terms of defining performance art through the body, and or mainly the American narrative of like where performance art started. But also there's this side of the ancestors for me that I feel like it's been there in African cultures, and there are artists who have created work and made work from dreams and divinations and stuff like that. But yes, there is sort of this trend that is coming up. I'm sure maybe your question is coming from that way. A lot of young artists are speaking from a spiritual, ancestral side, but also where the performance is taking place is also a question, in that she's performing in a gallery and she's exposing her body, because most of the time she's either naked or in this case she was wearing a bride, a panty and stuff like that. So there are a lot of contradictions in her work, which for me I think I do question in the thesis, and in terms of where one is performing, in terms of where your life applies, where doesn't it apply in this art, and I think it's things that we need to be very critical of as me, a black South African Xhosa woman coming from my own background, but at the same time I cannot speak for her, hence I place myself. I spoke about my experience of the performance before I got to the critical side, and really interrogating what she's doing, right? So, and then the tensions of the two spirits, hey? Yes, that's true. That's very, very true. And in the beginning of the thesis, I actually wanted to run away from it. You know, I tried to go the historical side. I tried, and my co-supervisor is Shalina, and my main supervisor is and we had these discussions. You know, where are you? We're not hearing your voice in the thesis. And eventually it came, and then I brought it out in the introduction. And I think, yes, it was those tensions, because as much as there's this cultural side and there's this Christianity, I made a choice in a way. But I have not spoken or disrespected the cultural side, because it's there in my background and in my family in a way. But it's something that has not been exposed to me that much at the same time. So yes, in the gallery it was me being conflicted with the tensions of what was happening from my own spiritual side and from what I was looking at during the performance.
So I used the definition which Dawkins was using, which was admittedly quite a narrow definition, which was a heteronormative definition of intercourse, which focused on penetration as well. But that was for the context of this text, but obviously in a different context, that word's definition would widen. You were right to point out that there is a difference between rape and intercourse, and apologies if I didn't make that quite clear in my presentation. In the context of who fears death, that is not intercourse, that is sexual violence against women. And as for Andrea Dworkin, I was just drawn to her because her along with Catherine McKinnon, problematized certain notions of consent, which I was quite interested in, especially concerning whether you could pay for consent. So she was quite on my mind a lot, which is why I used her.
Okay, well, just talking to the idea of contradiction, I think that's exactly what I'm trying to outline, because as I continue to do research on science fiction in Africa, I'm finding that this is an issue that crops up in every representation around blackness and magic, and connecting that to an ancestral past. So yeah, I completely agree with that idea, that it always pitches up now or manifests as a contradiction. And I think maybe that's what makes the conversation interesting. So I don't think it's something that authors necessarily try to resolve. And then just to speak into your question about how this links into what we would consider a more African perspective, right? So in our previous conversation, the previous session, there was this idea that, well, magical, I think Pumla was talking about how magical realism isn't what we would describe as an African reality, right? That's an imposed word to describe what's already, magic is already in part of an empirical reality in Africa. And that's a very popular, line of argument in science fiction in Africa, that this is in fact not speculative fiction, that this is merely a representation of how we view and navigate reality. And so on the one hand, that is in fact true, and it does apply across the board. But then I'm always interested, especially in relation to more contemporary texts, as to how this is, especially, and I think more in a gendered context, how there's always this very intimate relationship to trauma and violence and the lack of empowerment. And so then there's maybe an argument there where maybe female authors predominantly are trying to problematize that a little bit. I don't know. So maybe that it doesn't sit as comfortably with female authors precisely because it undoes a lot of work in relation to a gendered argument. Because as I mentioned, magical black female has an entire history in relation to popular culture that isn't very empowering. So it's always in the state of contradiction, and I don't think it should be solved. And I just, I agree with your comment. I think that's precisely what's interesting about magic and power.
I think the two hands up here, and then were there any others?
Yes.
Right.
Okay. Thanks, guys, for your papers. Sci-fi is always something that I'm interested in. So yay. Nedine, so I'm listening to you give your answer to the questions around contradictions, and so perhaps what I'm going to say will just really be, take it as you want. But I did kind of want to hear a little bit more about what your sense of the link between what a very kind of very material, almost experiential senses of black girl magic, in terms of the hashtag, in terms of all the stuff that circulates in popular culture, and what they kind of the meaning that they're circulating here being aspiration, determination, encouragement, and then what you kind of read there alongside a very spiritual, quite deep, otherworldly sense of black magic, not necessarily black girl magic, which is then actually not often gendered, if that makes sense. And so for me it's really a question of how you resolve it, and perhaps, as you say, this is not something that you want to resolve, which is fine, but how do you then, in terms of genre, how do you think about the fantasy sci-fi side of it, the spirituality, And then the circulation of this hashtag is very kind of, these spaces. And then the second question has to do with popular culture, and you said it more than once, that popular cultures are often not very kind to the black girl, black female figure, whatever. But again, coming back to the African setting, I'm wondering if that changes something, because African popular culture is actually quite accommodating of the black girl, but in a very different way again. So I don't know how that works its way into your brilliant presentation.
Thanks.
I have a question for Philiswa. I'm very impressed by your how you observe the performance, and I think that's an amazing work you've done. And what I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but what I see is also that by you being there, you witnessing it makes it already both a performance and a ritual. Like, I just had this, like, in court cases, right? If someone gives you legal paper, then you are being served because you were there bodily. So for me, when I'm in any church and any kind of sacred context, I'm actually I don't feel free. So I think there is something with the contemporary art, Western contemporary art performance, which taps into that. If you look at the Marina Abramovich lying naked on that cross made of ice blocks, waiting for someone to lift her before she actually passes out of hypothermia. And so there are these so it always, I think, linked into these kind of spaces of sacred, where performance space was used for sacred usage, and actually implying the bodily presence of the viewer. Like in that talk, which before I had, where Skubuzo was standing, did that walk to the arch, and there was the gallows, and he handed people Molotov cocktails, implying them because they were present. Or yesterday, when Linda was sitting and refusing for Michaela's hair to be cut, very vehemently took the scissors and sat on the scissors, although the artist had asked for her hairs to be cut. So I think there's something. So I really thought that was like one of the most amazing gestures of witnessing. Like, I am not here to witness that, Another person is not present here, said like, oh no, that's too triggering, I'm leaving. So, like, are you present? Are you witnessing? And then it's interesting, the second performance, you were not there. And so I think there is something which I find very, very exciting in the complexity of what is a performance and what does it mean to be bodily present, and actually to listen here, and that implicates you, it makes you complicit. And then when do people leave the room, right? I mean, you have it in Parliament, you have it, like people leaving the room. And that's like, there is something to that. If you are not witnessing, it's like you can hear them from others, but you are not there. So
you experience it differently.
Yeah. So and that actually a performance is actually performed when someone is there. And that's like what I'm thinking, or what I'm aiming at. So in terms of spatial relation, and then all the other questions. But yeah, I pause here.
Oh, nearly forgot. I think I wanted to talk about this thing in fiction, where the way we write or stage black magic, right? That there's always a question that follows up. Oh, where did they get the magic from? Is it dark? Is it whatever? But when Superman comes from out of nowhere and arrives, we accept it. We just take it as it is. When Superwoman comes out of nowhere, also we accept it. But as soon as it's Black Panther, it's black whatever, where does it come from? It's just full of patriarchy, full of whatever. It's just like, when is it okay just to accept that when we bring African science and African whatever as it is in fiction, and we accept it as it is without wanting to deconstruct it to a point where now we're ruining the magic that is happening. Because it ruins the magic. It's like, we know Black Panther and that's ruined. We like this. We start seeing all the negative things, but we still watch Superman.
It came from the ancestor.
Yeah, we accept Superman parents, no way, we just like showed up, no problem. Can I jump in
Yeah,
here? Because I think my question in this paper is born out of exactly this kind of frustration that people are voicing, because we find now, right? And if you think about science fiction, it's popular culture, it's a popular genre. However, with science fiction in Africa, there's always this political burden that surrounds a genre that's otherwise associated with great escapism, which by definition should be allowed or permitted because it's popular culture. So I think that's partly the issue, right? That always when introducing magic, especially in now a black female subject, how do you navigate that? Because you want to enjoy it as a hashtag black girl magic because I'm powerful and celebratory. Yet we find consistently it's being used as part of a political question. So you're recycling part maybe of a pre-colonial identity as a reaffirmation of contemporary identity in the light of maybe post-apartheid disillusionment, for example. It's never just popular sci-fi. And I think that's interesting. So, I mean, because even you said there are positive or affirmative representations in black popular culture, but that in and of itself is interesting because that's saying black popular culture, which is already an alternative genre. It's not popular, right? And so then in this capitalistic economy, I think black girl magic becomes interesting because that's a way of wanting to assert oneself in a more hegemonic discourse, right? Like how do we fight back against the system in the bigger sense of the word, which interestingly comes out of an awareness of a lack of power. And you were, just to answer your other question about black girl magic and spiritual, fantastic magic, I think that's also another interesting intersection now where we see that there's an increasing popularity or just maybe a greater awareness around science fiction in Africa. And then also this new capitalistic awareness of, well, even just rap and black culture, right, has become popularized in that very Taylor Swift problematic way also. So that's an interesting intersection to explore, which I think maybe black girl magic kind of, alludes to that intersection.
I'll give Linda the final word because
A
she's
question
my
for
boss.
Jacolien and blame Tina after this for this question. But when you started, you were very uncomfortable. I don't know if you're uncomfortable, but you kind of expressed reservations about why you were on the panel. You said talking about it not being speculative.
No. This one isn't science fiction, but she writes science fiction. But this is the one
but
that
I mean,
is
also, but all of you except for Philiswa are doing speculative, and I don't know. So one of the things. So why were you uncomfortable with that, first of all? But also, Brown Girl. How can she? So she herself does two things that she writes: speculative and science. Nalo.
Lila Hopkinson. She doesn't really care much for labels. She writes what she enjoys, what she feels is important. So she'll speak about her work as science fiction or fantasy and fantasy, and the whole genre boundaries that's precisely what, and not just her but other writers as well. They push those. They say, why is this not necessarily classified as science fiction? Because I'm bringing magical elements in. So, the label thing, it was just simply because this is the one book that doesn't really fit with the science fiction. That was only, in the way that it would generally be labeled.
All right, I think let's call it there. Please continue our discussions over. First,